During the ownership of the ailing Rover Group by BMW in the mid to late 1990s, there were several major products being considered, which could have helped to reverse the long collapse of the last major British car manufacturer, one of which was an interesting little scheme known as the Rover 35 and 55, which went under the codename of R30, a proposed mid-size hatchback which would have bridged the gap between the high-end Rover 75 and the upcoming new Mini as a viable competitor to the likes of the Volkswagen Golf, only for the wider politics of the failing Rover company to axe this promising model, though not completely spelling the end for what it may have become in a suspected life after death. For context, by the early 1990s, the Rover Group, which had been formed during the privatisation of British Leyland in 1986 by the government of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, was in a difficult position, the reputation of the firm having been tarnished time and again throughout the 1970s and 1980s due to a plethora of build quality problems, public relations disasters, industrial strife, and outdated models. With a full revision to the Rover Group product lineup during the mid to late 80s, which saw many models developed using Honda underpinnings and body shells, doing little to reverse the company's fortunes, cars like the Rover 200 and 800, together with the Austin Metro, Maestro and Montego, as well as the ever-present Mini of 1959, just barely scraping by amid a swarm of reliability concerns, the most high-profile being the ill-fated attempt to re-establish a car on the American market in the form of Sterling, a variant of the Rover 800 built for US customers that suffered woeful reviews and even worse sales before being axed after only 3 years in circulation. With a loss of £892 million having been recorded for the 1986 fiscal year, the newly formed Rover Group had been sold in March 1988 during its breakup and privatisation to British Aerospace for £150 million, with the understanding that the firm could not be sold on to another party for a minimum of 5 years, during which time BAE, amid its own attempts to make a profit through the sale of regional commercial airliners and military aerospace projects, showed little interest in actually investing heavily into the forward planning at the Rover firm, setting stringent budget limits on model development, which ultimately saw the collapse of several promising projects to replace the Mini, the Metro and the Rover 800, the latter of which merely amounted to a 1991 facelift dubbed the R17 scheme, while at the same time, thanks to its association with Honda, the corporate direction preferred by British Aerospace was to simply base their models on existing Honda products wherever possible, so as to create an economical short-term solution, examples of this mindset coming to fruition in the form of the Rover 600, which, with the exception of the badge and grille, owed the entirety of its underpinnings to the latest version of the Honda Accord, as due to the Honda-specific nature of its engineering, Rover could do very little to the car mechanically so as to differentiate it from its Japanese counterpart. Nevertheless, the tenure of Rover Group under British Aerospace did produce some results, the Land Rover division being a huge seller on the international scene thanks to its highly successful Range Rover luxury SUV and the rough but utilitarian Land Rover Defender, while the release of the Land Rover Discovery in 1989 provided a much-needed bridge in the market segment between the lower-end Defender and opulent Range Rover, which itself was due a facelift in 1994 under the P38 scheme, while elsewhere, in a bid to push Rover's image upmarket, cars such as the facelifted Rover 200 hatchback and corresponding Rover 400 saloon, as well as the larger Rover 600, proved to be incredibly popular on the domestic market, advertising for the firm choosing to appeal to a younger, more aspirational buyer, which helped to dispel the somewhat tawdry image cars such as the Metro, Maestro and Montego had placed upon Rover's shoulders during the late 1980s, though regardless of these improvements, British Aerospace continued to run a tight-fisted operation, and appeared to simply be running down the clock as their 5-year contractual obligation neared its end in late 1993. Eventually, in an unusual though not wholly unexpected move, British Aerospace sold the Rover Group to BMW at a cost of £800 million, the reason as to BMW's surprise acquisition of the UK carmaker being to create a more competitive firm on the wider motoring market, BMW having established itself firmly as a producer of sports saloons such as the M Series, luxury models like the 7 Series, and sublime Grand Tourers like the 8 Series, but had no low-end or economy cars to call its own, meaning the BMW Group was unable to compete with rivals such as Volkswagen on equal terms, as this possessed a sports car division with Porsche, a luxury and high-end division with Audi, and a mass-market division with Volkswagen itself, the long-term outlook being, if BMW did not expand its influence dramatically during the 1990s, by the turn of the millennium there was a distinct possibility that, as the smallest of Germany's car-building firms, it could be purchased outright by its rivals at Volkswagen or Mercedes-Benz. The choice was, therefore, simply to buy an ailing mass-market car maker and then use the profits of this firm to help support the wider BMW Group without diluting the prestige of the BMW name, and therefore, through injections of cash and the influence of German executives at the Longbridge plant in Birmingham, the company set a new course for the Rover Group that would see a complete refurbishment of its product range, the priority of which was to axe those models which still required the use of Honda underpinnings such as the Rover 200, 400, 600 and 800, as the acquisition of Rover by BMW voided the former's contract with Honda to supply parts and technical assistance that had been signed in 1979, thus requiring significant royalty payments by BMW to Honda in order to allow the continued use of their engineering, while older British Leyland models such as the Metro, Maestro, Montego and Original Mini would be retired over the course of the decade and replaced with a new swathe of cars, although the ownership of BMW was not entirely to Rover's benefit, as with the launch of the highly popular MG-F in 1995, as a revival of the legendary MG marque, BMW refused to sell the car in the United States, as they feared it would steal sales from their own brand new drop-top roadster, the BMW Z3, killing a potentially lucrative market for the MG brand. As someone who firmly believed in his commitment to getting the Rover Group back into the position of a self-sustaining car maker, newly appointed CEO of BMW, Bernd Pichetsrieder, believed that the best course of action for the Rover Group would be a hands-off approach, allowing the management in Britain the ability to run their side of the business with a generous degree of autonomy, as well as giving the research and development teams at Gaydon near Warwick a free rein in which to develop a slew of brand new cars that would replace the Rover 200, 400, 600 and 800, as well as the Metro, Maestro and Montego. BMW's direction for Rover being to create 3 platforms upon which would be placed the company's mainstream models. A small-size platform for the upcoming new Mini, which would replace the original Mini on its 40th anniversary in 1999 as a small family hatchback, the larger Rover 75 platform as the company's top-of-the-range model, and a mid-size platform onto which would be placed the Rover 35 and 55, the first of these 3 platforms to begin development being the Rover 75 or R30 of 1998. And was an amalgamation of traditional Rover ideals and up-to-the-minute technology that utilized a brand new platform with BMW's Z-axle rear suspension layout and carryover K-series engines in lieu of the new generation 4-cylinder range of power plants due for launch in 2002. After the R40 would come the R50, which was to form the basis of the new Mini, and would again carry the BMW Z-axle, but eschewed the K-series engine in favor of a Tritec unit built in conjunction with Chrysler, who had been a potential partner for Rover during the 1980s when British Leyland was facing its protracted demise, the new Mini being built on a bespoke platform and would be styled in a manner that updated the general aesthetic of the original Mini for the 21st century, becoming among the greatest front-wheel drive cars ever released. The third car in the triumvirate was to be the Rover 35 hatchback and Rover 55 saloon, which came under the codename R30, this car coming last in BMW's priority of new models, even though the desire to create a machine along these basic principles was paramount if both BMW and the Rover Group wanted the latter to succeed financially as a subsidiary brand. The more crucial of the two being the Rover 55, which began development in late 1996 as a replacement for the Rover 400, which was based on the underpinnings of the 1992 Honda Domini, and, even after the end of the Domini's production during 1997, remained in assembly at Longbridge despite being based on near-decade-old mechanics from a discontinued generation of car, the Rover 55, which came under the codename R60, being expected for launch in 2002 alongside the BMW new generation engines in 4- and 6-cylinder form, while the front-wheel drive car's power packs would have been longitudinally mounted in a vein similar to front-wheel drive Audis, as demonstrated when long-nosed Rover 200 engineering mules were tested with longitudinally mounted K-series power plants in place of the upcoming NG engine. The initial styling of both the Rover 35 and 55 was undertaken by the Rover team at the company's research facilities in Gaydon, although several third-party design houses were contracted to submit ideas, including Futura Studios of Birmingham, who delivered in the spring of 1997 a full-size clay mock-up of the Rover 55, which would form the basis of a 2-pronged strike into the executive market alongside the top-of-the-range Rover 75, while Omni Design of Solihull, as well as BMW's own design studios in Germany and the United States, took on the responsibility of giving a face to the Rover 35. The overall leadership of the design team being headed by Richard Woolley in the UK, with early styling and engineering being undertaken by the Rover team at Gaydon, before moving to BMW's facilities in Germany as the design became more advanced, while at the same time early design work for the R50 Mini, carried out by BMW in Germany, was moved to Gaydon for finalisation, early concept images for the R30 being of a retro styling due to the presence of a large chrome grille similar to that of the later Jaguar S-Type of 1999. For the power plants, development of these units would be done at a brand new engine factory that was to be established at Hams Hall to the east of Birmingham, and would comprise a mixture of low-power BMW M47 diesels, the Tritec engine shared with the new Mini, and, in the larger engine models, the all-new NG 4-cylinder engines, while configurations for the R30 range would consist not only of the 3- and 5-door hatchback models, but also a mid-sized MPV or multi-purpose vehicle dubbed the Rover MPV, and the Rover 55 Saloon and Coupe, which would sit on the UK L1 platform below the Rover 75's UK L2 platform, while the car was also to be fitted with the Z-axle at the rear, just like the Rover 75 and the Mini, and a strong central structure for crash safety. Sadly, the R30, as well as the larger R60, were both being developed at completely the wrong time, as in spite of the great promise proposed through BMW's purchase of the company, together with a hands-off approach to managing Rover by the German executive board, by late 1996 it became heavily apparent that inordinate sums of BMW money being injected into the firm was producing very little progress with the upcoming Mini, R30, R60 and Rover 75 schemes, leading to BMW taking more and more control of the operations within the Rover firm so as to ensure that projects were being delivered in a timely manner, while at the same time, the reliability of Rover's products continued to show the same dubious nature that had damaged the reputation of their cars during the 1970s and 80s, most notably within the highly important Land Rover division, the Land Rover Discovery being so notorious for its breakdowns that it practically sacrificed the Australian market to the Toyota Land Cruiser, while the brand new flagship Range Rover P38 was of such poor fit and finish that it would go on to top consumer lists as the most unreliable luxury car on sale for the time. All these factors combining to see Pichetsrider's hands-off approach being questioned by the BMW company board, and the mumblings of a corporate revolt taking place due to a lack of confidence in his leadership, Rover's market share having dropped to a mere 10.9% in the UK by the end of 1996. Amid a continuing loss of autonomy as BMW sought to directly manage Rover's affairs to produce results, a new business plan was established wherein, by 2000, the BMW corporate empire would comprise Rover as a low-end mass-market producer, BMW filling the role of sports saloons and executive models, and Rolls-Royce, which was purchased jointly alongside Bentley with Volkswagen in 1998, filling the ultra-luxury market segment so as to combat the likes of Porsche and the proposed revival of the Maybach marque by Mercedes-Benz. The result of this being the Rover Group getting pushed down market so as to avoid overlap with BMW's own models, and the R60 project, as a large family car, being scrapped in late 1997, as the Rover 75 was moved in to fill this role, the Rover 55 now being simply an additional variant of the R30 scheme. One blessing and curse for the company was the brief appearance of the Chrysler Group at the end of the year, who proposed a potential tie-up with BMW to create 1.4 and 1.6-litre engines for the Mini and Chrysler Neon from a factory in Brazil, the upside being that Chrysler's additional investment could have helped to bring the Rover 35 and 55 to fruition, but with the downside that it would render the proposed Hams Hall engine plant surplus to requirement, only for these hopes to be dashed in May 1998, when Mercedes-Benz, seeing BMW's motions towards the Chrysler purchase, came in and stole the American car builder for themselves, leaving BMW solely responsible for getting the Rover Group back on its feet through the possible hope that the Mini, the Rover 75 and the R30 would be the market winners needed to redress the balance. 1998, though, proved to be the most disastrous year for the Rover Group, as the Mini project was delayed from its 1999 launch date to 2000 and later 2001, the Rover 100 Metro was axed from production following a horrendous Euro NCAP safety review of just 1 star out of a possible 5, and currency fluctuations between the pound sterling and the Deutschmark, meaning it was becoming increasingly difficult to sell Rover products in Europe with a strong pound, while BMW had to compensate for the lower value of their cars by upping production and sales on the British market, of which Rover now only possessed an 8.6% share. Staff cuts at BMW, as it lost substantial profits during the exchange crisis, meaning that 1,500 jobs were lost during this period, and some elements of the firm had to be reduced to a 4-day week. Things came to a head on the launch of the Rover 75 at a special ceremony held near Tower Bridge in London during late 1998, where, in an unexpected speech, Pichetsrider, who had come under heavy flack from the press and governments of Britain and Germany for his running of Rover and BMW, as well as the purchase of Rolls-Royce and Bentley with Volkswagen, aimed strong criticism at the British government for their lack of commitment to helping subsidise the R30 project with taxpayer money, as well as lambasting their scepticism when it came to joining the brand new euro currency so as to stop the exchange fluctuations between the UK and Germany. The intention of his shock speech being more to try and get the trade unions to accept upcoming job losses at Longbridge by placing blame on the British government, and thereby free up funding to finish that plant's refurbishment and get the R30 into production. The result of Pichetsrider's comments, regardless of his intentions, being to embolden his opponents and cripple confidence in the outlook of Rover's prospects, as demonstrated when Walter Hasselkuss, chairman and chief executive of Rover, resigned only weeks after this event, when it became apparent to him that the Rover firm was damaged beyond repair and no work by BMW could be done to help ward off its impending collapse. Pichetsrider himself wouldn't face the error of his words until January 1999, when, in a bid to get the Mini and R30 onto the assembly line, he required the BMW company board to sign off on a £500 million cash injection to tie the firm over for the 1998 fiscal year, £450 million for the day-to-day operation of Rover that would be delivered over the course of 3 years, and a total investment of £1.7 billion to finish off the R30 for a 2002 launch date, of which £1.2 billion would be spent completing the renovation at Longbridge to allow for R30 and Mini production to take place. The German CEO, aware that BMW couldn't solely foot the bill for the scheme, appealing to the British government for a state subsidy of £200 million, which would come to be known as the R30 subsidy, although in light of his earlier comments against the UK Parliament, the then Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, Peter Mandelson, immediately rebuffed BMW and denied them the subsidy, declaring that Rover was a private company and thus no concern for the state, the result of this retaliation being taken as a great insult not only by the BMW company board, who had injected billions of pounds into both Rover and the UK economy, but also the workforce of the West Midlands, who were now firmly of the belief that the Labour government had no care for the needs and future prospects of British industry, and would rather put their own grudges with foreign car builders as their first priority. Eventually, Prime Minister Tony Blair himself was forced to mediate directly, and following Mandelson's resignation over an unrelated matter, the new Trade Secretary, Stephen Byers, presented Pichetsrider a second opportunity to win over the support of the British state, laying out to Bayer, during a visit to Longbridge, his intention to spend the government subsidy on refurbishing the plant and getting the R30 finalised. Pichetsrider, who had staked his entire future with BMW on the R30 and practically started a boardroom civil war over his handling of the Rover debacle, making one last attempt to woo his superiors in Munich with a new range of models at a price of £1.4 billion that would comprise 2 basic platforms off which would be based the Rover 75, the Rover 55, the Rover 35, the new Mini, and a proposed crossover SUV dubbed the Rover TCV, each of which would be delivered over the course of 6 years, his outlined plan impressing some elements of the BMW company board, but being considered too expensive and too lengthy to implement by his own boss, BMW chairman Eberhard von Kuenheim, the dropping of his planned range being Pichetsrider's last chance to save his premiership, and thus led to him resigning on the spot, his 5-year efforts to revive the Rover Group going completely up in smoke. After a day-long battle for leadership, the role of BMW CEO eventually went to Joachim Milberg, who not only had BMW executives undertake a purge of the Gaydon Research Centre, replacing British managers and workers with German ones so as to allow for direct oversight of the Mini and R30 projects, but also outlined his own business plan, which took many elements from Pichetsrider's scheme, but would be based solely on the delivery of the R30 in both British and German guises, the UK version of the car being marketed as the Land Rover Explorer, the Mini Maxi, and the MG Mini Sprite, while in Germany it would be sold as the BMW 2 Series, production for Rover models to be set at 400,000 cars per year in order to maintain profit, although once again, all hope hinged on the commitment of the British government to provide a necessary subsidy of £200 million for the R30 scheme, Byers being able to initially convince Milberg that the UK state would be willing to provide at least £180 million of regional state aid, until he was informed soon afterwards that Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown, could not justify such a large sum of taxpayer money being invested into the ailing car firm, fearing that the Blair government would be tarred with the same terrible brush as the Callaghan government of the late 1970s, who had partially nationalised Rover Group's predecessor, British Leyland, and spent exorbitant sums keeping it afloat to no avail, the only figure that the Treasury was willing to provide Rover eventually coming to a dismal £118 million, which, coupled to a corporate loss of £647 million for the 1998 fiscal year, meant BMW shareholders were now fully of the conviction that the German car giant was about to be dragged down into inevitable collapse alongside the irredeemable British car maker. In the end, getting the R30 subsidy descended into not-so-veiled threats by Milberg and the BMW company board, who stated in no uncertain terms that if more money wasn't granted in the RSA, Longbridge would be closed, and operations moved to a brand new factory in Hungary, with the R30 expected to go on sale for the 2002 model year, regardless of what obstacles, political or otherwise, got in BMW's way. Tony Blair himself eventually having to intervene directly by way of upping the original offer to £129 million, which would then be topped up by the Birmingham Chamber of Commerce to a total of £152 million, payable over the course of 5 years, this sum being not nearly enough to support the R30 scheme, and thus, with confidence shattered, leading the BMW board to develop an exit plan from the Rover Group, which took place over the course of the next 8 months. The R30 project, by this point in the calamitous state of affairs, being very much near the final stages of its development, as one running prototype had already been produced, and all the engineering and styling, as produced by Omni Design, was essentially finalized. The team behind the R30, during the few tests undertaken of the machine, commenting positively on its looks, its driving characteristics, and its performance. This, sadly, meant nothing to the wider politics of BMW's messy divorce from Rover, and as various partners and venture capitalists attempted to line up the future of Rover among themselves, the final layout, as per a last-minute deal in May 2000 with the Phoenix Consortium, a group headed by 4 major business figures within the British car industry, was to have the Mini marque, as well as the upcoming R50 Mini, be retained by BMW despite Phoenix's attempts to grapple it back from the German car builder. The resultant new Mini eventually being launched in 2000 and would go on to become one of the best-selling small family hatchbacks ever built, a title it still holds today. Well, in order to provide some compensation for the massive losses incurred by BMW during its ownership of Rover, the Land Rover division was sold off to Ford for a tidy sum of £1.5 billion. The heavily depreciated Rover and MG marques themselves reverting to the Phoenix Consortium for a nominal sum of £10 to become the MG Rover Group, which would struggle on in fiscal failure, dwindling sales and scandalous affairs for another 5 years before finally collapsing into administration on April 7, 2005. As for the R30, a car that had nearly bankrupted BMW and caused a boardroom civil war that cost the firm's CEO his job, the intellectual rights to this scheme were retained by the German carmaker, with the sole running prototype being taken back to Munich, where it apparently remains today. BMW attempting to sell the project, initially back to MG Rover at a cost of £300 million during 2001, before finally offering it to a number of Chinese manufacturers, looking for a proposed medium-range car model that was essentially ready to enter production and required only minimal financial input to bring to fruition. The closest of these being with the China Brilliance Industrial Holdings firm, who had a pre-established partnership with BMW that dated back to the 1990s, when the former intended to sell license-built Land Rover Defenders for the Chinese market from a factory in Shenyang near the North Korean border, although in the end, nothing would ever come for a potential Far Eastern variant of the Rover R30. Perhaps the biggest rumour of them all is the fact that, in the face of the Rover debacle proving that BMW had the brand strength to move downward by itself without the need for acquiring a weaker volume car maker, the company took the body engineering of the R30 and placed it onto the modern-day BMW 1 Series family hatchback of 2004, the smallest member of the BMW range prior to the i3 of 2013, and was affectionately dubbed the Baby BMW. As while the concept of a small BMW had existed since before the Rover buyout of 1994, and were largely stymied by the focus BMW was putting into getting the ailing Rover Group back on its feet, the overall look of the 1 Series, especially from the A-pillar back, lends credence to the notion that the German car maker simply took the near-finished R30 and reworked it to suit their needs, with even the engineering of the car, such as the engines, suspension and platform, also being generally along the same lines as the never-realized Rover. Ultimately, the Rover R30 project was another example of missed opportunities for the British car industry, the concept being very much sound, and was practically ready to deliver into the hands of both Rover and BMW a model that could easily have done battle with the likes of Volkswagen, Ford and Vauxhall, but with the wider whirlwind of financial woes, combined with political and cultural distrust between the British and German factions, it was inevitable that any promising scheme, despite the genuine effort being placed into the project by BMW, was ever likely to come to pass, and the Rover R30, together with the proposed range of models for Rover, would simply remain just another unobtainable dream.